forces, judicial interprets, those are all power.
Hi, and welcome to Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy for our early U.S. history series, where today we're going to look at the earliest European colonies in North America. Now, last time we looked at mostly the Spanish and Portuguese explorers, including Columbus, who helped launch Europe's drive to colonize this quote-unquote New World. And we talked about how it wasn't just Spain and Portugal, but the British, the French, the Dutch, who also looked to this new land in the hopes of exploiting its resources. So today we're going to focus on the earliest of these colonies established by England in what would one day become Virginia and New England. And just a reminder, teachers, that this PowerPoint with lesson plans and a variety of files and resources are available at Teachers Pay Teachers. Just click the link in the notes below or go to their site and search for Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy. So there were two events in Europe that really set the tone for the English to not only seek out new land, but to have the opportunity to settle in North America. The first was the defeat of Spain's navy, the Spanish Armada, in 1588. Remember, it was the Spanish who first claimed these lands and created early settlements, mostly in Central and South America, but in North America as well. With their navy out of the picture, the Spanish were unable to stop the English from colonizing these new lands. The other event was the Protestant Reformation. These were breaks with the Catholic Church that created religious tensions for decades throughout Europe, causing the persecution of those practicing religious beliefs that were frowned upon by the crown or the majority. In 1584, Queen Elizabeth I gave an English nobleman, Sir Walter Raleigh, the right to claim land in North America. The following year, he sponsored the first expedition to settle in North America, which landed on Roanoke Island off of what is present-day North Carolina, establishing the first English colony in North America. Most of those first settlers returned to England after only a year, but in 1587, Raleigh sent 91 men, 17 women, and 9 children to settle the colony. That year, the first English child, Virginia Dare, was born. It looks like it's a tourist attraction now. Meanwhile, the captain of that expedition returned to England in 1587 for supplies. His voyage back to Roanoke was delayed for 3 years as war had broken out between the English and the Spanish. When he returned in 1590, he found a deserted colony with only one clue: the word Croatoan written on a tree, or maybe it was a fence post. This probably referred to a nearby island which maybe the colonists went to, but they were never found. And thus, this mysterious fate of the first English colony has led it to be called the Lost Colony. A few years after this failed attempt, the English tried again with the creation of the Virginia Company to settle lands in North America. Now, this was a joint stock company, it's called, meaning investors bought shares in this venture to look for gold and to trade in fish and furs. It was purely a money-making expedition. In 1607, 3 ships carrying 144 settlers sailed up the Chesapeake Bay and established what would go on to be the first permanent English colony in present-day Virginia. Rather than finding gold and riches, these settlers found starvation and disease. Many of the settlers were quote-unquote gentlemen who were with their servants, and both were unaccustomed to hard work. They were mostly prepared to look for gold. The colony survived in part thanks to the guidance of their leader, Captain John Smith, who famously said, quote, "He that will not work shall not eat." And the settlers were also aided by their neighbors, the Powhatan Native Americans. The winter of 1609 to 1610 was referred to as the starving time, as tensions with the Powhatans grew, who had stopped supplying the settlers with food by this point. After the Powhatan captured Captain John Smith, we get the famous story of Pocahontas, who saved the captain from her father, the chief, also named Powhatan. Pocahontas would go on to marry one of the settlers, John Rolfe. Most likely it was Pocahontas who taught her husband, John Rolfe, to farm tobacco. And he helped introduce this crop to his fellow settlers, one that would become increasingly popular in England and throughout Europe, and help the Jamestown colony thrive. As the colony grew and more settlers arrived, they needed a government, and in 1619 they created the House of Burgesses, the first democratically elected lawmaking body in America. Meanwhile, the following year, around 600 miles to the north, a second English colony was established in North America by a group of settlers not seeking riches, but seeking religious freedom. Again, just a little background. In 1534, King Henry VIII broke ties with the Catholic Church and established the Anglican Church as the Church of England. A religious sect known as the Puritans didn't like the Anglican Church and thought it needed reforming. Many Puritans became Separatists who wanted to start their own churches, and they were persecuted for it. Some fled to the Netherlands, but in 1620, a group of Puritan separatists left for America aboard the Mayflower. They became known as the Pilgrims. While they had permission to settle in Virginia, they were supposedly blown off course and landed on Cape Cod in what is present-day Massachusetts. It's important to remember that this group was not entirely made up of Puritans. So before they moved on to Plymouth, they decided they needed some rules. The passengers, while still on the ship, signed a document called the Mayflower Compact. By signing, they agreed to obey the laws that would be established and organize themselves into a quote-unquote body politic to establish basically a government. This document demonstrates the principle of what is known as self-government, that these colonists would be ruled by a government of the people, not some nobility or far-off parliament. This document also contained the principle of a social contract, in which citizens agreed to give up certain things in exchange for an orderly society. Survival was very difficult for the Pilgrims, as almost half of them died in the first winter alone of illness, hunger, and cold. In the spring, two Native Americans, Squanto and Samoset, taught the Pilgrims to farm and to hunt. In the fall of 1621, the Pilgrims invited the Wampanoag tribe to a quote-unquote feast of Thanksgiving to celebrate the harvest, a tradition we still celebrate today in America. In 1629, another group of Puritans received a royal charter to establish a colony north of Plymouth. This was another company who chose a governor, John Winthrop, to lead 900 men, women, and children in establishing the Massachusetts Bay Colony, mostly located around a place they called Boston. During the 1930s, 15,000 Puritans settled in Massachusetts in what was known as the Great Migration, mostly escaping religious persecution and economic hardships at home back in England. In 1634, adult male church members were allowed to vote for governor and for representatives. Later, they established property ownership as a requirement to vote. Despite the fact that they came for religious freedom, the Puritans enforced strict religious rules, and they persecuted those who didn't agree with their rules, kind of like what happened to them in Europe. In 1636, Minister Thomas Hooker, who didn't like the way the Puritan leaders were running the colony, led his congregation to the Connecticut River Valley. 3 years later, they wrote the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, America's first written constitution and plan for government. The same year that Hooker was founding Connecticut, religious leader Roger Williams was banished from Massachusetts Bay Colony for his religious beliefs. Williams founded the town of Providence in what would one day become part of Rhode Island. The following year, Roger Williams was joined by other religiously persecuted settlers like Anne Hutchinson, a woman who was holding religious studies in Boston that the Puritans didn't agree with. These early settlers helped establish Rhode Island as a place for the religiously persecuted, one where they could practice freely. But Rhode Island and Connecticut weren't alone. 1 year later, New Hampshire was established as a place for settlers who disagreed with the religious practices of Massachusetts Bay Colony as well, led by John Wheelwright. And with that, we have the settlement of what will become the first 5 of the 13 colonies. In our next lesson, we'll learn how the remaining colonies were established, so be sure to check that out. But before you do, let's review. What was the name of the first colony in America, later abandoned, earning the nickname the Lost Colony? Roanoke. What was the first permanent colony in America, founded in 1607? Jamestown. What was the name of Jamestown's leader who said, quote, "He that will not work shall not eat"? Captain John Smith. What was the crop which helped Jamestown flourish? It's not good for you. It's tobacco. This document was signed on the boat by the Pilgrims, in which they agreed to follow the rules, the laws, the Mayflower Compact. What religion was practiced by the people of the Massachusetts Bay Colony? Remember, they wanted to clean up the church. They wanted to make it pure. It was Puritanism. True or false? Because they had been persecuted, the Puritans of Massachusetts let people practice any religion freely. You would think they would, but that's false. Which colonies were founded in opposition to Massachusetts' strict religious rulers? Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire. And that's it. I want to thank you guys for watching. Be sure to subscribe, because up next we're going to finish off those 13 colonies. Just a reminder, teachers, that this PowerPoint with lesson plans, smartboard files, quizzes, worksheets, and additional resources are available at Teachers Pay Teachers. Just click the link in the notes below, or search for Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy at Teachers Pay Teachers. Again, thanks for watching, guys. Keep up that good work.